Hello, everyone. Hello. We are thrilled to have you joining us today. It is right at 12 o'clock. Time is precious, so we want to make sure that we fill every minute with exactly the information that you are looking for. My name is Reagan Copeland. I am Duval County Public Schools Family Engagement Supervisor, and I oversee the Parent Academy, which is who is bringing you this fabulous information today in partnership with Miss Jamie King, who will be our facilitator for today. She is a supervisor for our exceptional education department, school psychology department. So she will be our expert on hand today. All right, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, here is today's presenter, Miss King. Take it away.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Jamie King. Thanks for the introduction. So I am the supervisor of school psychology in the Exceptional Student Education Department, but I am also the 504 coordinator for the district. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint. And today, the topic that we're going to be discussing is specifically about Section 504. So I'm hopeful that you will get some background on Section 504, the law itself, the purpose of the law, and then how we implement it to support students here in Duval County Public Schools. And then, of course, at the end, I'll take some time to answer any of the questions that you have about 504. So thank you for coming today. My contact information will also be here for you in the PowerPoint. So I'm going to get started, and I first just want to talk a little bit about what is Section 504. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is an anti-discrimination act that was put in place in 1973 to ensure that any programs that receive federal funding do not discriminate against individuals based on their disability. So Section 504 was specifically about how this is implemented in programs that receive federal fundings like schools. So this has been in place for a long time. It predates what we currently know as IDEA, which guides everything we do as special education. So Section 504 predates that. It's what we call an unfunded mandate. So what that means is the government tells us that we cannot discriminate against individuals with disabilities if we receive funding from them, which all public schools do. And so we have an obligation to ensure that we are identifying and providing free and appropriate public education to all students, including those with disabilities. So I've put a little bit of information about what FAPE actually is. So a free appropriate public education is when we are obligated to provide reasonable accommodations that give students with disabilities the same access to the benefits of public education and all those extracurricular activities as their non-disabled peers. So that's the purpose of the law. That's why it was created in 1973. In 2008, the Americans with Disabilities Act broadened the definition of a disability, and that is now what guides us in determining whether a student qualifies as a student with a disability under Section 504. So the purpose of the amendment in 2008 was to ensure more broad protection for students with disabilities. So the wording of the law was originally to ensure access to public education. And that's what we want to make sure that we're doing when we implement it here in Duval County. And to be clear, this includes not just traditional public schools, but any charter school and any activity that's associated with your child's school. So that means athletic activities, field trips, extended day programs, all of those things are included in this anti-discrimination law. So I won't get too much in the weeds with the legal stuff because I think that's a little boring, but I do want to give you kind of an overview of the difference between Section 504 and IDEA. So I want to talk a little bit about the similarities. So IDEA, again, is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that's the law that guides special education or exceptional student education. So students with IEPs. And I want to kind of compare and contrast it with Section 504 to give you an idea of the difference between the two laws and what they do to support students. So I'll start with some of the similarities. So one of the most important similarities is that either one requires your consent as a parent for the evaluation. So there is an evaluation process under both IDEA and Section 504 that you as a parent will be a part of. So you'll be invited to that meeting and you'll be invited to consent for that evaluation under both laws. You will also be protected from discriminatory discipline. So students with disabilities, whether it's under IDEA or whether it's under Section 504, can't be disciplined for something that's directly related to their disability. So here in Duval County, we have guidelines for disciplining students with disabilities, and those same guidelines apply whether the student has an IEP or a Section 504 plan. So those are some of the broad protections that are available for all students with disabilities. There are also specific procedural safeguards that you as a parent have and will receive at every single meeting. So whether it's an IEP meeting or a 504 meeting, we will provide you with documents that outline our procedures and how you can go about disagreeing with the team if you do, and what we call your due process rights. So that has to do with your ability to disagree with the team and move through a process of trying to compromise that might involve me at the district level, and or your right to file a complaint as a parent at the state or federal level. So under both IDEA and 504, you have those specific rights. Now, if any of you have a student with an IEP and you've been to an IEP meeting where you received your procedural safeguards, you'll note that they are very thick. You get an entire book. So the difference with IDEA and 504 is our procedural safeguards under Section 504 are much smaller, so much more limited. There are a lot more legal requirements under IDEA in terms of the procedural safeguards, but those procedural safeguards do still apply under Section 504. So now let's talk a little bit about the differences between the two. So as I said before, Section 504 is an unfunded mandate, which means that we don't receive any funding to implement this law. It's just a requirement that we don't discriminate against individuals with disabilities. So we provide those accommodations within schools and classrooms with the resources that are available. That's a little bit different from under IDEA, where a student has an IEP. There is funding directly attached from federal and state funding that the district receives to provide that special education service for a student. So that is one important difference in terms of how those things are managed and the funding that's associated with it. The other thing that's very different about IDEA is there are very discrete categories. So the federal law gives us 16 categories that we can look at. We call them educational eligibilities. And a student has to meet the specific criteria within that eligibility for qualifying under IDEA. So we have federal criteria, and then we also have state criteria that even defines that a little bit more. Unlike IDEA, Section 504 has a very broad definition of what a disability is. And I'm going to show you exactly what the law says about what a disability is under Section 504, but it was written specifically to be broad and include as many individuals with disabilities as possible to ensure we aren't discriminating against them. So our evaluation procedures are much different because under IDEA, we have very specific criteria and evaluative information that's needed. Whereas under Section 504, we're looking at a much more broad definition. And so the information that we need to determine whether a student has a disability may not require as extensive of an evaluation as it does under IDEA. Um, One of the major differences, though, is this third bullet point. So under IDEA, a student receives an IEP that provides specialized instruction. So when we say specialized instruction, it really means that the student requires someone to provide some instruction that's above and beyond what's available in the general education classroom. Usually that's an ESC teacher. Sometimes they also receive related services such as speech therapy from a speech language pathologist. Those are all examples of specialized instruction. So IDEA was created to ensure that that specialized instruction was provided for students. In contrast to that, Section 504 is meant to provide accommodations that allow access to the education, both the educational environment and the instructional content for students with disabilities. So that's very different. We don't provide specialized instruction under Section 504. We do at times provide some types of services, but usually those are not provided by an ESE teacher or anyone associated with an ESE type service. So, for example, as a service under 504, if a student, for example, had a hearing impairment, we might have a specialist, like an audiologist, who would come out to assist the student and the school with setting up equipment that a student might need to be able to hear appropriately in the classroom. And so those are the kinds of services and accommodations that would allow the student access to that instruction. Which is different from specialized instruction. If a student needed an ESC teacher to come and reteach the content, that would be specialized instruction. So that's the major difference between the two. And I'm kind of reiterating that because I know I get a lot of questions from parents about, do I need an IEP or a 504 for my child? And so I just wanted you to have a good background understanding of the difference between the two. So if you do have concerns about whether your child might need supports or services for a disability, you will have a little better understanding of what you might want to ask for or what might be available for them. So under IDEA, that team that makes up the IEP team is very strictly defined. We have to have specific individuals at that meeting. It's a little more broadly defined under 504. So the law doesn't really tell us who specifically needs to be there, other than telling us that they need to be knowledgeable of the student. So we do have some district guidance that we provide. I provide training for our 504 designees, and I provide a manual for them so that they have a better understanding and outline of who needs to be invited to those meetings and how to conduct those meetings. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. One of the other major differences is there are a lot of state rules and statutes related to IDEA. There's federal laws, and then there's state statutes and rules. Whereas under Section 504, it's just the one law. So we have the one Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and then we have that Americans with Disabilities Amendment. And that's really all we have to guide us. So a lot of times what we're using are information that's provided by the Department of Education and by the Office for Civil Rights. So the Office for Civil Rights is the federal oversight of Section 504. So if you ever had a concern about Section 504, the Office for Civil Rights would be the one who you might reach out to, in addition to our State Department of Education and the Federal Department of Education, which also monitor our implementation of this law. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about what 504 is and what it is not, I want to talk a little bit about the roles and responsibilities and who's involved in this process. So the main person that you'll need to know at the school level is your 504 designee. So usually this is the school counselor, but the principal might designate someone else in some circumstances if they don't have a school counselor, or some charter schools have different organizational structures, and so they might have someone who wears a number of hats, and this might be one of them. But the 504 team includes the 504 designee, as well as you as the parent and the student's teacher. We may also have other individuals who can share information or provide input. Sometimes the school psychologist will participate if there's some sort of evaluation to review, but primarily you are going to see the 504 designee, the teacher, and yourself make up that 504 team for the majority of meetings that you'll have. And then the 504 coordinator, that's my role. So I'm in the district role of training and consultation. And then I also provide support whenever parents have grievances or there's any kind of compliance issues. I step in and try to support to help us come to an understanding of what needs to occur to support students at school. So the 504 designee is you as the parent. That's your main contact. So if you're not sure who your 504 designee is at the school, I recommend that you reach out first to the school counselor. As I said, it's usually the school counselor who is designated as the 504 designee. Sometimes it'll be someone else, and if it is, hopefully the school counselor can let you know who that person is, or you can reach out to the principal at the school who will be able to tell you who that person is. The 504 designee's role is to case manage, which really means making sure they're responding to you as a parent if you have a request, if you have questions. It also means that they set up and schedule meetings and they ensure compliance. So that means that we're holding our annual meetings, teachers getting copies of plans, and making sure that everything is updated in focus and that you're getting a copy of everything that you need as a parent, including a copy of the plan or procedural safeguards or anything like that. So now that you know kind of the background of the law and who is important to participate in the meetings and who you can contact to ask questions at the school level, I want to talk a little bit about determining eligibility. So what does it mean under the law to have a disability? So this slide outlines specifically the questions that we have to answer as a 504 team to determine if a student has a disability. So there are two steps in this process. The first step is to determine if there is a mental or physical impairment, and if that mental or physical impairment substantially limits a major life activity. And I added some extra words there. It says without regard to mitigating measures. So mitigating measures are really anything that might help a student overcome their disability. Many times the first thing that we think of as a mitigating measure is medication. Some students take medication to manage symptoms of their disability. And when we're determining whether a student qualifies under this first step, we have to make sure that we're not considering the effects of that medication. So for example, if a student has diabetes and it's well managed, but they have to take medication, we don't use that to determine whether they qualify. So we know they're always going to need medication to manage that disability. And so we're not going to use that, whether they're taking the medication or not, to determine eligibility. Now, in the second step, that's where we determine whether the student needs accommodations. So once we determine they have a disability and it impacts a major life activity, then we as a team determine, does the student need accommodations? And if so, what do those accommodations look like? And that's, if we decide they need accommodations, that's where we would develop the 504 accommodation plan. And that would outline exactly what the student needs in the classroom. So this is exactly what the law outlines. And the Americans with Disabilities Act expanded the definition and, quote, in favor of broad coverage of individuals under the Act. So the purpose of that amendment was to ensure that we are using the most broad definition of an impairment to ensure that we are identifying all of the students that could potentially qualify for protections and or accommodations under this law. So if you are interested in learning more about the law, it's actually very short to read, not super entertaining, but this is sort of a breakdown of what you need to qualify under Section 504. So I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about what a physical or mental impairment is defined in the law. So a physical impairment is really any physiological disorder or condition. It gives some examples. Those examples are not exhaustive, but as you can see, it could be anything from neurological disorder, respiratory disorders like asthma, cardiovascular disorders, digestive disorders, any kinds of physical impairments might qualify. And any mental or psychological disorder, such as an intellectual disability, organic brain syndromes, emotional or mental illnesses, and specific learning disabilities. That section is also where things like ADHD fall, and things like anxiety, depression. We see a lot of those kinds of diagnoses. They fall under that mental category. So those are the two areas that we look at, physical or mental. And then we determine, is there a substantial limitation on a major life activity? So what is a major life activity? This chart kind of gives you an idea. Again, it's not exhaustive, but it gives you an idea of all the different major life activities that we could consider. And those major life activities may or may not be observable in the school setting. For example, you see sleeping on there. So a student may have an impairment that impacts their ability to sleep. And that might present itself in the school as the student having difficulty paying attention, concentrating. They might be irritable. They might have trouble getting their work done. So we may see impacts of that limitation in the school environment, even if the substantial limitation isn't observable in the school. So again, this is not exhaustive, but these are some of the things that we look at. And you can see that some of them are physical, like being able to stand or lift, but then some of them are more academic, like reading and concentrating and thinking. So we need to consider all of those things. We don't want to just consider one area. We want to make sure that we're looking at the whole child to see how is this impairment impacting their life? And that's what we would do with determining if there's an impairment on a major life activity. So I have some examples of physical impairments, specifically things like diabetes and seizure disorders. We want to make sure that those students all have 504 plans. There are some specific state laws around care plans for those students, but there is a difference between a health care plan and a 504 plan. So many of these medical conditions might require a healthcare plan to ensure that the school's medical staff or the nurse who trains the school staff knows what kind of healthcare services the student needs, but it does not provide the same level of protection that Section 504 provides for students with disabilities. So in cases where a student may have diabetes or a seizure disorder or some other medical condition, such as a severe food allergy that might lead to anaphylaxis, those kinds of things we want to also make sure that we're considering whether 504 is appropriate and those accommodations are in a plan if the student needs them. And the 504 plan, unlike the healthcare plan, outlines anything that's educationally relevant as well. So while there may be some things in the healthcare plan that the nurse needs to know, there may be something that the teacher needs to do in the classroom that's very important. For example, students with diabetes often need to have their blood sugar checked before they take tests, because if their blood sugar is not in the right range, they may not perform at their best. They may not be able to stay awake. They may be irritable. They may have trouble paying attention. And so that's something that the teacher might have to prompt or support the student in doing every time there's a test in the classroom. So that's something really important for the teacher to know, not just healthcare staff. So there is a difference between a healthcare plan and a 504. So if you have a student who has a medical condition, who has a healthcare plan, and you think they might also need accommodations in the classroom, you might reach out to your school counselor to find out if a 504 plan is appropriate. So I'll also provide some examples of mental impairments. So these are things like learning impairments. So there are different times when students have a need for accommodations because of a processing deficit or a learning impairment, but they may not necessarily need specialized instruction from an ESE teacher. So, for example, a student with dyslexia may need accommodations for extended time, but maybe they've been able to cope with their disability and they don't need specialized instruction anymore. Maybe they've learned how to read on their own, but they now just need those accommodations in place. So those kinds of things might fall under Section 504. It also might be more social emotional impairments. So things like ADHD that affect a student's ability to pay attention or concentrate or organize themselves. It also includes, like I said, things like anxiety and depression, those sort of internalizing symptoms. Those are sometimes more difficult for us to see, but they have impacts on students. So the student who has a lot of anxiety may not look off task, but she may struggle to get her work done, or she may struggle to complete tests on time. So those kinds of, if it rises to the level of a substantial impairment, could potentially qualify under Section 504. So now that you know what might qualify under Section 504, the next step is, what do we do? So what we would do is we would hold, after we determined eligibility and we said, okay, this student needs accommodations, we would hold a 504 meeting. And once the student has a 504 plan, you hold a 504 update meeting every school year. So we try to get those done at the beginning of the school year in the fall. And the 504 designee will distribute the current 504 plan from the previous year to all the teachers at the beginning of the year. So they should go into the classroom knowing who on their roster needs accommodations and what those accommodations are. And then in the fall, we try to give it a couple months for the teachers to get to know the students. And then the designee will start scheduling update meetings for the teachers to participate in and give input along with you as the parent about what's working, what's not working, whether things need to be changed on the accommodation plan to support the student. We also want to make sure that we get input from as many teachers as we can. I know sometimes in secondary that can be difficult to get all the teachers in one meeting, but we want to make sure we try to get input from them about how the student's doing in the classroom. Sometimes that's just written input from, a teacher statement that the teacher gives to the designee so that they can give some input on how the student's doing. But that meeting is not to determine eligibility. It's just really to review the plan and make any changes. So that should happen on a yearly basis once you've determined eligibility. And you as the parent can also request a 504 update meeting at any time in the school year. So the meeting doesn't just have to be at the beginning of the school year. If you have concerns about your student struggling in class, you can request an update meeting. We also have in our student progression plan requirements for what's called lack of adequate progress meeting. For if students are not making adequate progress, we need to come back to the table and hold a meeting to find out what do we need to do to support this student. Are there other accommodations that they need? Is there more that can be done? Do they need interventions? Do we need to refer on for additional evaluations? We also want to make sure that we're addressing all those behavioral needs in the 504. So if students are struggling to stay on task or have behavior concerns in the classroom, is there something that needs to be put in the plan to support that and increase the students' on-task behavior and participation? So those are things that we would do during the update meeting. Um, you can also have a 504 plan for a temporary impairment. So this is good for you to know in case you have a child who falls and breaks their arm right before the state testing at the end of the year. We can put in place temporary 504 plans for impairments such as a broken arm if the student is going to require accommodations to be able to be successful. So temporary plans are usually put in place for 6 months or less. And then after that 6 month period, we would come back and say, okay, does the student still need these accommodations? If not, we dismiss the plan if the broken arm is healed. In some cases, let's say, for example, the student had a concussion and the concussion wasn't resolved after 6 months, we might come back and say, okay, well, let's do some more evaluation and see if the student needs additional services. So that's what a temporary plan is meant to do. Whether it's a temporary plan or a full-fledged 504 plan, the most important thing are the accommodations that we put on that plan. So the meat of the 504 plan are those accommodations. And those accommodations are determined based on individual student data. So we never want to just say, okay, all students with this impairment get these accommodations. No, we want to be mindful in that meeting about what does the student need and what does that look like specifically for this student. The identified accommodations are necessary to provide a student with a disability an equal opportunity to be successful in the classroom. It's not meant to have an extra advantage. What I tell a lot of the school counselors when I talk to them is that most students will benefit from accommodations, but that doesn't mean that they need accommodations or that they qualify for them. So when we're considering what accommodations to put on the plan, we want to make sure that we're putting accommodations on there that are unique to that student and that allow them access to their education so that they can be successful. We also want to make sure that we're considering any information that you bring in as a parent. So if you've had an outside evaluation or you have a doctor who's recommended specific accommodations, definitely bring those to the team so that we can review those. It's not required for you to bring in an outside diagnosis, but anytime you have information, especially when it's a physical impairment, because we're not medical professionals, we're educators. So when you can bring something to us, we want to make sure that we're considering that and that we are putting things on the plan that that student needs. We also want to make sure that accommodations are aligned across settings. So if a student requires an accommodation in the classroom, that might extend to the testing environment for high-stakes tests and vice versa. So if a student doesn't require an accommodation in class, we wouldn't necessarily put it in place for high-stakes testing unless we have data to support that there's a need only for that area. And then again, as I said, those are reviewed at the beginning of each school year, and we make sure that they're reviewed prior to those state tests and that those accommodations are in place for students. Okay, so there's probably going to be questions about that, but I want to leave plenty of time at the end for you to ask those questions. And I want to just mention, this is kind of the final piece of information here that I'm going to share, and then I'm going to open the floor and let you ask any questions that you have. But the procedural safeguards, I talked a little bit about that in the beginning. Those are part of our process that we provide to you every time you have a meeting, but I wanted to go through exactly what's in there. So the written prior notice means that we aren't going to do anything to change the plan without giving you prior notice. That also includes a notice that a meeting is going to occur. So anytime a 504 meeting is scheduled, you as the parent should receive an invitation from the 504 designee outlining when that meeting will occur. And then after the meeting, you'll get a copy of the plan with any changes that were made. We also want to make sure that we're communicating in your native language as the parent. So that means that if we need to get an interpreter for a meeting, we will do that so that you can understand the information in your native language. Again, we always need your consent before we do an evaluation. So that's one of the things that we need your participation as a parent to provide your written consent if we're looking at whether a student is eligible or not. Of course, we want to keep all of students' information confidential, and we're not going to release any information to anyone who doesn't have a legitimate need to know in terms of providing educational accommodations for that student. So we wouldn't be sharing your students' information with other teachers who don't need to know. That being said, you as the parent can always ask for copies of records of 504 plans, and you can receive that information at the school. So you can just go to the school and ask for a copy of that plan if you need it, or email your 504 designee. You also have the right to what we call mediation. If there's a situation where you don't agree with what's happening at the school level, hopefully we're able to resolve it locally. Usually I'll try to come in and help resolve locally before we move to mediation. But if we needed to move to mediation, there's a procedure for going through that process. And then you also have due process rights as a parent. So if we're unable to resolve it at the school level and we're unable to resolve it in mediation, we may move to a due process hearing that actually involves an educational judge and attorneys and those kinds of things. And I do get involved in those cases, but I'm always trying to make sure that I can resolve it at the school level. So if you ever have any kind of concern about compliance or implementation of a 504 within your student's school, please do reach out to me first, and I will work with you to try to resolve the issue before we hopefully, we can resolve it before it has to move to due process. But we always want you to know that you have those rights. So that is the bulk of the information I have to share with you. I'm going to put my slide up here that has my name as the 504 coordinator. And then I've also put the information for our Director of Health Services, so that if you have a student who does have some specific health needs, sometimes we need a nurse involved to help us develop those plans. So she can be very helpful in reviewing that information and making sure the right people are at the table. I've also put Heather McCabe, who's the supervisor of related services. So occasionally we need to bring in other people like an OT to help us develop accommodations and provide support for students who may have some kind of physical impairment. And then I put our deaf, hard of hearing specialist, Rhonda Giffen. Her information is on there. If you have a student who may have a hearing impairment, she is a great point of contact to make sure that we get all the right people at the table. If we're looking at, do we need an audiologist who can help us set up that special equipment? And of course, if you need someone who's not on this list, feel free to reach out to me. I am the contact at the district level as your 504 coordinator, and I'm happy to point you in the right direction if I'm not able to answer your question myself.
All right, Miss King, this has been truly a pleasure. I'm so grateful for you taking the time to present to us today. Families, I know I gathered new information that I'm grateful for, and I trust that you did as well. If you think of something later this afternoon or this evening and you need to reach out and have a follow-up question, no problem at all. We would love to share it with you. We hope to see you again soon at another Parent Academy course. We offer these courses multiple times a week, each week of the school year. Thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen. It was an honor always to have you with us. Take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you again soon in the near future. Bye-bye.